will ask here tonight if what I noted by my own presence here, that there's a kind of almost mirror inversion, one man and a whole panel of women, seems to kind of mirror inversion of the outside world. And that's, of course, one of the things that we're here to talk about. I wondered if the reverse might be true when one moves to the museum. It's a realm that we're only starting to explore in the explosion of museum studies, or other aspects of large architectural culture that we're going to submit tonight to the lens to discover not only what are the opportunities, but also what are the regimes of power, of influence, and territory, territory for action as well, that occupy and are active in each of those realms. For in the larger milieu in which architectural decisions and reception is made and shaped, women seem at first glance to have gained an increasingly secure foothold. I even wonder if the museum might be one of the places where that was pioneered, and only subsequently the other realms we will explore here tonight, the world of journalism, although one can think back to such pioneers as Maria van Rensselaer, who wrote the first penetrating book on Richardson in the 19th century, if it wasn't only later in those realms that women began to take a significant role. But not too easy, because I think that role was always circumscribed in certain ways that I maybe just sketch a few notes about. Certainly our keynote speaker, Gwendolyn Wright, was a pioneer in looking at the cultural field of architecture rather than simply the old professional or art historical tunnel vision of the work and its creator, in books that highlighted the diverse other ways as clients, subjects, reformers, and intellectuals that women made a difference, tried to create a place in the drama and the challenges of modernism, since that's our other subject, not simply architecture, but actually modernism and the complex of phenomena of modernization around architectural modernism. But before we become too triumphant about how antiquated the old social norms are, it is necessary also tonight that we think aloud and discuss just what controls, what taboos, and what unspoken assumptions still operate in the overlapping arenas in which a place is made for women in architectural culture. Tonight we will spiral out from practice, represented here by two practitioners, Toshiko Mori and, of course, Beverly Willis herself, to address the interlocking spheres of the places where culture, theory, and judgments are made: schools, museums, magazine and book publishing, all places where women have had a role in the launching and shaping of modernism. Our role tonight is to discuss not only the contours of those contributions, but also the forces that have shaped them, limited them, or directed them, and what shifts may or may not have taken place in recent years. Beverly Willis has been challenging limits, or just creatively ignoring them, for over 40 years now, with her work as an architect trained both in fine art and engineering, with her willingness to brave her own practice, to take on city officials, and to carve a practice of projects and reflections at every scale, from the interior to the cityscape. She is a founding trustee of the National Building Museum in Washington, in whose magazine in 1993 she asked the provocative question, "Is the master builder dead?" She likes provocative questions. It has been 30 years since a great exhibition, Women in American Architecture, Historical and Contemporary Perspective, organized by the Architectural League of New York and curated by Susanna Torre and others, was mounted at the Brooklyn Museum. I remember that 1977 event well, a room of easels, each one representing the work of a different woman practitioner, a kind of secret army. 2 years later, the International Archive of Women in Architecture had been founded, documenting the work of figures primarily from the late 19th century to the immediate post-war period. Julia Morgan, Marion Mahoney Griffin became suddenly household names, even if Sophie Hayden, author of The Women's Building at the World's Columbian Exhibition at Chicago of 1893, did not. But Chicago formed the focus of the path-breaking research in the 1970s, also that led to a series of studies on the role that women had played, and in which, I'll return to this later, Gwendolyn Wright, among a small handful of others, played a pioneering role. Despite this increasing spotlight on women as designers and as motors of design, as late as 1995, when Abby Bussell published a much-cited article in Progressive Architecture, Women in Architecture Leveling the Playing Field, only 9% of the membership of the AIA consisted of women. And that number had increased only to 13% nearly a decade later when, 3 years ago, in 2004, the AIA delegates passed a resolution calling for data collection to help us better track progress. So this is not really a closed question at all. Tonight's panel has therefore both a history and, in fact, a necessity. The questions remain of actuality, even as many would, to quote the Beatles, say, "You have to admit it's getting better all the time." That is only one of our questions tonight. But what are the larger spheres of architecture, from everything from the issues of domestic reform to the role of women in the academy, in the world of publishing, professional associations, juries, galleries, and museums. To close my remarks and to turn it over to the instigator of tonight's event and the founder of the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, just a few words about the museum, because I can not resist dipping into the archives. And I think MoMA is really an interesting place to stage this discussion, since it would be possible to celebrate tonight its history of women in decisive roles. I don't intend to do that, not a triumphalism. I think there are lots of questions to ask, but I just want to give you a few facts to ponder. After all, the museum itself was largely founded by women, women of means and thus of influence, as well as vision. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Lily Bliss, Mary Quinn Sullivan, although its first president and director would be men. A. Conjure Goodyear, and of course Alfred Barr. All of the departments were headed by men, but many of the curators from the beginning were women. And this was particularly true in architecture and in film, two of the departments which represented Barr's vision of a wholly novel type of museum, one that broke with conventions upheld further up Fifth Avenue. From the founding of the Department of Architecture and Design 75 years ago this autumn, women have played crucial roles and even influential roles, even if the historical record has overtly favored the men in the record. Philip Johnson is so indelibly associated with the department that the critical role played by Elizabeth Mock and Catherine Bauer in the early years has been dramatically underplayed. They are known more in the history of housing reform and debate than in the history of architecture, which tells us as much about continued prejudices in the canon of architecture and its history as it does about gender roles. And indeed, the history of women as influential arbiters has been continuous in this museum, even if the power structures have often impacted the resonance and the awareness of their work and place. Ironically enough, or is it, the aesthetic taste-making agenda was upheld by men, albeit gay, while the social and politically reformative agenda in the 1930s was spearheaded by women. Philip Johnson followed up the international style with the legendary machine art show, aestheticizing propellers, springs, and machine parts as works of art, while in the same year Catherine Bauer brought her housing reform agenda to the museum, playing a key role not only in display, but actually in housing policy, the housing exhibition of the City of New York in 1934, the very same year as machine art, followed up by architecture and government housing in 1936. Elizabeth Mock was even director of the Department of Architecture from 1942 to 46, during which period the Department of Industrial Design became a separate department under Elliott Noyes. But it was not until 1949, in fact, that the first exhibition, so after Mock, devoted to a woman designer was held at MoMA. And that, almost predictably, was devoted to textile design in the tradition of a now famous gender divide, which has been much studied in the history of the Bauhaus. And indeed, the subject of the exhibition was none other than Annie Albers. Although women would occupy major and less strategic roles in the department in the post-war decades, Mock's Built in USA series were astoundingly important agents of the Americanization of modernism. Ada Louise Huxtable would cut her teeth here, writing the labels for the Mies van der Rohe exhibition in 1949, and Greta Daniel and Mildred Constantine would organize key events, publications, and exhibitions. But it was not until 1980, under the direction of J. Stuart Johnson, that another monographic show, the second, on a woman designer would take place here, this time dedicated to Eileen Gray, one of the figures highlighted in the 1977 Brooklyn show. In 1989, Matilda McQuaid organized a projects exhibition with the still relatively unknown Elizabeth Diller and Ricardo Scofidio, so the first couple that we'll encounter, followed the next year by a show on Bauhaus weaving devoted to Gunther Stölzl and Annie Albers, noch einmal. She's the only woman to have two exhibitions at MoMA. And in 1996, Matilda's great show on Lily Reich, architect and designer. And that, I have to tell you, is the complete and exhaustive history of the exhibition of women designers at MoMA. Women, too, have been great contributors to the Department of Collections of Architecture and Design, great patrons of the department, from Phyllis Lambert, who was celebrated here last week, who was instrumental in bringing the Mies archive, and for many other gifts, to Lily Auchincloss, and in more recent years, Patricia Cisneros and Barbara Jacobson. But that's just a bunch of facts for us to crunch into the history, but I do think it's fascinating that from the very inception of this department, women played such an enormous role. So I want to hand the podium over to Beverly, who I think has some introductory remarks. We'll frame the evening and say some thank yous. I just want to thank Beverly and Wanda Babrisky for bringing me this idea and this terrific set of panelists.
Thank you, Barry, for that introduction and great overview. And also want to thank you for hosting this evening and for making this program possible. Thank you, Barry. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you here tonight. And I say, it's really great to see you. I'd like to express thanks and deep appreciation to the MoMA staff, Peter Christensen, where is he? Laura Bilas, and to the foundation staff, the incredible Wanda Bubisky, who developed the program, assisted by Darielle Cobb and Gail Ettinger. And I would also like to thank the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for underwriting a partial part of this program tonight. I'd like to tell you a story. Look at the graphics behind me. See the word women. It was intentionally written to look as if it were chalk on a blackboard. In the 60s, women practitioners were well aware that recognition of their work, no matter how hard they tried, was like chalk writing on a blackboard followed by an eraser. And we want to grab that eraser and throw it away. And we want to imprint the word women firmly on the pages of history. We want to revisit and reassess past thinking. We want historical recognition for the significant architecture designed by women. I have lived through the greater part of the classic modernist era. As the years went by, I saw the work of women in the 20th century being forgotten, even when their work was well recognized during the years of their practice. For example, Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was all but forgotten in the years after her death in 1958. Until a friend of mine, Sarah Boutel, spent the last 20 years of her life and $30,000 of her own money to compile a best-selling book about the work of Julia Morgan. And that brings me to the mission of the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation. The mission of the foundation is to expand the knowledge about women's contributions to architecture. The foundation funds research about women practitioners in order to provide all women architects with a tradition within the history of architecture. It includes the fields of architectural design, landscape design, the building arts, urban planning, historic preservation, as well as architectural history and criticism. The foundation's objectives are to emphasize the significant role women have had and continue to have in shaping the built environment, to recover and reassess these contributions, and to document these achievements through publications, film, exhibitions, collaborative programs, and public conversations like that here tonight. And I would like those of you who haven't already done so to pick up a brochure about the foundation on your way out. It will give you more information about the foundation than I'm giving you here this evening. Or you can go on to our website, bwaf.org. The purpose of the colloquium, and Barry has done a superb job, as usual, in giving you the wide, broad perspective of women in the profession. But the purpose of this colloquium is to explore the stories of women in modernism and how architectural arbiters have shaped its history and ultimately its legacy. The goal of the evening's discussion is to examine or even discover some of the stories that rightfully belong to and enrich the history of modernism. I'm delighted you're here. Enjoy yourselves and the stimulating discussion to come. Thank you.
Just a word about this format of this evening. I'm going to introduce Gwen Wright. I can't resist. And then she's going to give a paper which has been circulated among the respondents, and I'll introduce them at the end of Gwen's talk, and then they will speak each for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion that I will attempt to animate among ourselves, and if you're looking impatient, at that point we'll segue to you. It's a great pleasure, enormous pleasure, to introduce a friend and colleague of the last 2 decades during which we were teaching together at Columbia, Gwendolyn Wright. Gwendolyn has undertaken numerous groundbreaking, innovative investigations that have opened up whole territories of modernism and modernization to new questions. Architectural history has been shifted by her work, first on questions on the role of women and on the discourses on the domestic, in 2 books that grew out of her dissertation and are still landmark points of reference. One, a focused study of the epicenter of Chicago, Moralism in the Model Home, Domestic Architecture and Cultural Conflict in Chicago, 1873 to 1913, published in 1980, and 1 year later, the broad-reaching history, Building the Dream, A Social History of Housing in America. Housing up to that point had been either the bailiwick of sociologists or historians of the city. If taken up at all by architectural historians, it was through the reformatory lens of European modernism. A decade later, Gwendolyn Wright made a timely and grounded contribution to the emerging post-colonial lens turned on modernism in her important work, The Politics of Design in French Colonial Urbanism. She has worked on national identity formation, on the uses of history in schools of architecture, and countless other subjects around the problematics of a larger cultural field of modern architectural practices. So it's not surprising that she should be one of the few women to be invited to participate in Reaction Books' New Modern Architectures in History series. And I think some of you saw that the galleys are out there, so it won't be that much longer until you can read it. But perhaps we'll get something of a preview tonight. Gwen, I forgot to say, was trained as both an architect and a historian at Berkeley, has won too many awards to be cited if we're going to stay on time, and is going to show us here some of the intellectual background that even informs her new role in life as history detective. Thank you, Gwen.
Well, I'm extremely happy to be here, and I want to give special thanks to Bev Willis, to Wanda Brzezinski, and to Barry Bergdahl for helping this event happen. Bev has been saying quite rightly that this is a historic event. It allows us to think about this interconnected history of women architects and the history of modernism. Women architects extending that to looking at women in museums, women as publicists, women as writers, not only in professional magazines, but also in popular magazines. How can we understand something more about the complex and diverse history of modernism by looking at it through this different lens? Now, architecture, like all professions, has its internal mechanisms of power, judgment, and decision-making. These are usually taken for granted. They seem venerable, untouchable, yet up to date. Scientists call this a cascade. That is, that you have a set of ideas that nobody's really examined very much, but everybody keeps repeating them. And to ask questions, they call a reputational cascade. That is, you get a torrent of criticism on you. You might lose your job. You will be declared someone who is out of date, who is just bitching, who is causing problems. It is difficult to try to question things that are established. And that's one of the reasons why we have to ask, how is it that none of these or many other standard, well-known books on the history of modern architecture are by women or include work by women architects? It's strange that modernists would be so cautious, because every form of modernism has involved a critique of the status quo, an effort to redirect or improve or at least enliven conditions in the present day. But challengers, too, pose their own orthodoxies, and bold claims, absolutist claims, are much easier to get across to people than quiet, relativist questions. So tonight we're going to be asking a lot of questions. Other modern professions, after all, have asked questions about themselves. medicine comes to mind, it began about 20 years ago to engage important questions about the physician's absolute authority, about patient rights and conflicting opinions, about cultural differences and traditional medicine and alternative forms of practice. Is it just a coincidence that so many women were coming into medicine during those years? Many of them became quite prominent, and that such extraordinary innovations evolved, that medicine became much better at reaching more people and advancing in terms of new kinds of knowledge, totally different from what the predictions had been. By contrast, architecture tends to sustain rather outdated myths that sanctify authority. Many people still see that modernism was brought to the United States in the famous 1932 exhibition here at MoMA by Europeans and their acolytes here, as if it was something you could put in a suitcase and carry from one country to the next. In the same way, the events here and elsewhere in the 1970s that were often called the battle between the whites and the grays seem the major event that defines those decades, which were so tumultuous in so many other ways. How is it that certain things and certain people can be seen as the epitome, therefore erasing the multiple expressions of modernism, of questions of producers and recipients? Our focus this evening is a related myth that there have been very few women and no significant women modernists in architecture. The actual statistics are quite surprising, but evidence rarely triumphs against cultural biases. So tonight, we're going to look at these systems of power that describe and therefore define what is modern architecture, or at least true modernism, good modernism. And therefore, how do we look at these edges? How do we look beyond those definitions to try to understand how decisions were made about what is significant, who was important, and what drops down from there? We'll consider, as Barry said, 4 different kinds of institutions. In part, we'll be looking at each one of them as a way to look at women outside or peripheral to architecture as practice. We'll look at the ways in which architecture schools have functioned, museums, various publications, magazines, and books, both ones for the profession and what are often still called popular books or popular writing, as if anything outside of one small group was just playing at Kmart. And we'll also be looking at a range of organizations that are important in part because they provide funding for various individuals and programs. So in looking at all of these, we'll understand something more about how these decisions are made. It's not simply to critique them, but to understand how power operates, here as in every other profession. Some of these institutions are more powerful than others, but none of them have ever purposefully excluded or denigrated women. Indeed, women have often been significant voices in these institutions. And besides, as people say today, things are so much better. The Beatles are indeed with us. This is, again, sometimes called a failure of success. That is, that doing something well, beginning to make a change, is taken as a sign that everything's fine now. So it's really just bad taste to talk about these problems. If we raise the interest in ecological or sustainable architecture in the present day, I think we could make a point about gender. It's becoming fashionable, and that doesn't really help us address important and deeply entrenched problems. Now, we know that every form of power operates to maintain its authority. Some tactics are verbal, insisting on cohesion against the enemy, in this case, those who misunderstand or misinterpret true modernism, or those who don't stand for good architecture. Elusive terms that are by and large defined by what is outside, what is other, as we say today. Or numerical rankings. Here are the 100 or the 500 buildings that are worth it, implying everything else is down at the bottom. Both establishment institutions and the avant-garde rely on criticism of modern architecture to insist that they're under siege and therefore they have to hold together. Their standards have to be upheld. No one can break ranks. And in fact, people who do are criticized. I've been called cantankerous, difficult. I'm capitulating to the mass market. I'm capitulating to new urbanism, which was news to me. But it's interesting how vicious people can be, insisting that asking a question is going over to the dark side, that we need to ask questions. That's what knowledge is based upon. It is not turning against good architecture. It is not a repudiation of modernism to ask these kinds of questions. It's an assertion of legitimate, even commendable convictions to raise issues, but it's also a sign of suppressed fears and aggression. Just think how often you've heard, we all know what's important. We all know who's important. We all know what's significant, etc. And sometimes they are doing this. That magisterial we is unclear. Who is defining who this we is? But that's certainly right. Anyone outside is basically dehumanized. Certainly, they aren't worth listening to. It's not far from our president saying, you're either with us or against us. Another tactic, veneration for the architect, his intentions, formal imprint, and radical inventiveness, has a similar effect. The rhetoric of ineffable awe is quasi-religious, a matter of belief, not analysis or judgment or comparison. Again, nobody here wants to begrudge real talent or to deny that there are differences in quality and originality. Some people are really bad architects. We need to be able to say that. It's not as if we want no standards. But this mystical reverence for the architect makes it difficult to question myths, to challenge the norms, to ask questions about standards, to explore multiple kinds of invention, exploration, intentions, and effects of architecture. These ideals have also affected everyone in the profession. They're not simply issues for women, but they have particularly held women back from recognition that they are due. Challenges don't have to be aggressive. As Barry's forthcoming show on prefabrication will demonstrate to everyone, they can be exciting, turning the tables as he's doing, looking at the processes of making architecture, not simply at the products, being willing even to look at a range of people outside of architecture does not mean disrespect for architects. It teaches people a lot, architects as well as the public. Now, that being said, there are some problems we have to focus on tonight. Who can deny that the principles of universal modernism, certainly a worthy aspiration, too easily ignored ecological differences from one place to the next, and marginalized, often maligned, all sorts of people who didn't fit this template of modern man. That is, someone rational, healthy, educated, forward-looking, white, and male. It's not as if we want to turn against people who have those qualities, but we do want to expand and ask more questions about environments, about people, about cultures, about ambitions. To ask those questions, again, is not to deny the aspirations of modernism. Architectural discourse often falls back on certain tropes, and especially on dichotomies. My ideology is better than your ideology, kind of thing. And women do it too. That this has been a part of trying to promote one's cause, is to say, there's the enemy. That's what will happen if you don't listen to me and abide by what I'm saying. The most familiar opposition of modernism versus tradition rests on simplistic polarities about progress versus backwardness, or creativity versus copying, or good versus bad. Everyone declaims those dichotomies, of course, but fear and rhetoric keep them omnipresent. These artificial oppositions ignore the vast, diverse, and dynamic spectrum that lies in between those extremes, what's sometimes been called the excluded middle. This is the realm of modernity as experiences, as human experiences in the plural, positive and negative, innovative and adaptive. Gender oppositions are obviously perpetuated with dichotomies. They're in some ways the fundamental dichotomy. And again, women have used them, asserting that women bring certain values that men don't have, which I think can be at least equally exclusionary. We may disagree here tonight about there are certain innate qualities that women bring as designers or writers, but we all know that we're cautious about essentialism, but it's still there. It's deeply entrenched in our culture and in any others. Cultures rely on these prevailing frames or ideas, and the easiest one suggests these oppositions. In 1911, the philosopher George Santayana used architectural tropes to contrast the modernity of the American man and the skyscraper with the inherent conservatism of the American woman and the historical revival house. In 1976, the historian H. Allen Brooks blamed the decline of Frank Lloyd Wright and progressive architecture in the Middle West after World War I on the fact that women had gotten too much power in their families. These assertions sound preposterous today, but they're still present, even if they're rarely spoken about. Fortunately, there are some notable alternative analyses of modernism that have appeared in the last few years. Now, I've been asked to try to speak about the history of women and the history of modernism in terms of some of the strategies and findings of my new book, which builds on the legacy of these books in particular. It's part of a series called Modern Architectures in History that looks at more than 25 different nations, from Austria to Turkey to the US. And again, it's not essentialism to look at nations. They exist, even in our global world. There are good qualities and bad qualities, but we cannot deny that formal laws, informal conventions, even imaginaries about what is possible or where we want to go as a culture are shared among a people. They may exist elsewhere, but they're very defining, even for people who want to challenge those norms within particular nations. The parallels with gender, I think, are quite conspicuous. So I began to think about modern life as well as modern architecture in the US and more generally. Artistic modernisms vary. We now acknowledge there are many modernisms, not just alternatives from the one true, but there are many kinds of modernism as form. And likewise, there are many experiences of modernism. It's elicited complex and conflicting responses. There's a heady liberation, but there is also a sense of materialism, alienation, new kinds of inequities, a sense of loss or foreboding. Most modernists don't want to acknowledge those problems. That is, they say, just going over to neo-traditionalism, but it's not. It's untenable for us to speak about a single modern consciousness rather than passionate, contradictory, and contentious variations. Now, this led me to 4 sets of questions about modernism that I want to pose for all of us, each with implications about the role of women, past and present, and ambiguities about goals like innovation or unity or inquiry in the defining institutions of modern architecture. First, modernism is largely considered endogenous, even as architects are supposed to just know what is important happening in the world, in every aspect of the world, economic, social, political, and somehow able to represent, we used to call it a zeitgeist, to represent that and indeed to direct it. So we can ask, have institutions highlighted architects' supposed autonomy and their ability to represent positive modern phenomena, but downplayed more ambiguous, exogenous interrelations? Women's rights, after all, are a critical expression of modern freedoms in families, in work conditions, in public places. But complexities remain. Traditionalists celebrate the home in a very archaic, even unrealistic way as an ideal, but modern radicals have often dismissed domestic life and family altogether as inherently oppressive, a long-term theme, going back to Baudelaire or back to the flaneur walking in Paris, getting out of the oppression of the home onto the streets. But we still have to look at positive aspects of housing and families, and some problems, even some dangers on the streets and in public places. We might ask, for instance, how did office buildings change with the feminization of office work around 1900? Was that entirely liberatory for women? Or how did changes in demography and national culture and family life in the Depression of the 1930s affect houses and housing, as chronicled in government brochures and posters, but also in popular books like The Modern House in America by James and Catherine Morrow Ford, which had a wonderful range of more regionally inflected modern buildings? Or what happened to the women defense workers and their families during World War II? Women museum curators, as Barry pointed out, took up these questions during the 1940s. Elizabeth Mock and Catherine Bauer launched exhibitions on war housing, childcare, schools, and Mock's very popular show called Built in USA, 1932 to 1945. That is what happened after the famous 1932 show that affirmed what she called a humanist and regionalist and diverse kind of modernism. Grace Morley, who was director of the San Francisco Museum of Art, emphasized environmentalism as a fundamental aspect of modernism during the New Deal, and then offered a show to a fledgling group of young male and female architects, landscape architects, planners, and political reformers who called themselves Telesis. She encouraged them to ask questions about modern life, to prompt the viewers to think in different ways, to walk among them and talk to them, rather than simply issuing dictates about what modernism was and what modern life should be. Her 1949 exhibition, Domestic Architecture of the San Francisco Bay Area, affirmed Lewis Mumford's ideas, which were then under attack at MoMA, and integrated historical and regional influences, downplayed individual names. They weren't even shown in the catalog, only in a code at the end, and featured work for progressive, moderate income developers alongside custom-made houses. So why, we have to ask, was that legacy erased? And it was conscious. Philip Johnson not only fired Elizabeth Mock, but he took over her Built-in USA title and used it for another exhibition and catalog in 1952 that showed very different kind of work. That was a process of erasing her presence and the ideas that she had put forward. A shift in perspective is disorienting at first, but then eye-opening. You have to really think, how do you place yourself if you see the map of the globe in a different way? So how might we rethink the usual structuring of architectural history in terms of breakthroughs and major individuals, buildings, stylistic labels, as if these determined everything that happened? This led me to organize each of the chapters in terms of major changes in work life, in home life, and in public life, including various kinds of infrastructure and site planning, asking how architects, both important architects and minor figures, responded to these changes, or sometimes didn't. To what extent did generic shifts in architecture in particular buildings get involved with the changes that were happening in the society? Now, the major figures and the important buildings don't disappear when you do this. They come right back up to the top. But there's also a lot of relatively unknown work, much of it by women, that comes up as well. For instance, we have, I'm sorry, this is out of place. Let's see. We have here at the top a solar house using the first photovoltaic cells, not just having it be a matter of orientation, that was designed by Eleanor Raymond and her friend, the physicist Dr. Maria Telkes. Or we have down here what many people considered the first modern university, designed during World War II by Marion Manley, who then had to share the title of architect with her colleague, Robert Law Weed, who was brought in after the end of the war. Now, we can think about these things in terms of criticizing what has been left out, but I think it's also helpful to ask, what are some places to try to move across, back and forth across various boundaries? This means looking in part at a range of fields or subfields that have often been treated marginally and have often been associated with women. Issues like gardens and landscapes, or textures and interior design in particular, or the ways in which history can be incorporated as part of modern architecture. The schools tend to be either celebratory, posing certain buildings and individuals as godlike examples, or critical, in which they insist that anything else is just deferring to capitalism or is not worth doing, and actually cautioning architects quite often not to build because they would be capitulating. So we can ask the question, how can institutions, from museums to schools to publications, present various problems and challenges for architects without being either too deferential or too exclusive? Can the expertise that women have brought to these fields be reasserted as they are once more coming back to the fore? We need multiple strategies and lenses for expanding the canon, not just the desire to do so. With all due respect for great architectural masters, we can ask, how have other architects functioned, professional and amateur, exceptional innovators and ingenious adapters, women and men, even market-based commercial firms and those builders who are responsible for 90% of what gets built in this country? Why don't we look at them too, as Barry is doing? I decided to include women designers in every chapter of this book, rather than having a special section on women. And I want to appreciate, to say how much I appreciate the support that the Beverly Willis Foundation gave me in doing this. In fact, it wasn't that hard. If you go back to the historical record, they're there. They're in the magazines. There's interesting work that's being done. In fact, one of the things that was fascinating is not only did I find women, but I found them working on kinds of projects that were different from what has been premiated in the past. For instance, during the 1910s, a time often called the progressive era, devoted to social reforms, the rise of feminism, there were a number of ways in which modern housing was being challenged to go beyond villas for the rich and workers' housing, but to also ask, how can we have simpler economical housing for ordinary families, for single women? Ways of asking how progressive women's clubs and schools can function. The 1960s and 70s saw much the same thing. Another epoch of reforms and feminism that generated new concepts and forms, like the Marietta Stevens and Thomas McNulty's House for Their Family, which has no walls. The idea was to have totally shared child rearing and housework, and to have the children be able to experiment with new ways of being alone and being together. Or we can look at the extraordinary range of efforts like this community center to try to think of modernism in a more ingenious and sort of thrown together patchwork way that would work in inner city neighborhoods, that would not simply be a representation of how life ought to be lived, but thinking instead about how to bring in varieties of people. Many women served as editors and journalists in media. So we want to think about, as a fourth issue, the ways in which the media has functioned, not just professional magazines and books by architects, but again, especially this popular media that's almost never discussed in histories of architecture. Newspapers, newspaper critics, ads, movies, television, practical books, and shelter magazines. Now, we can see ways in which, at the turn of the century, House Beautiful and Ladies' Home Journal were actually really progressive. They had a lot of articles about housing for single working women. Can you believe it? They wouldn't today, but they did then. And the Cosmopolitan of all magazines had an article by the feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman that explained how feminist was the apartment hotel, a place where you could have your own apartment as a family as well as a single woman, and have many services from cooking to childcare to laundry be communalized, not all having to do it together and be happy, but to say, pay for it. We'll have it here. We'll have restaurants. We'll have places in the apartment hotel that give freedom to women. And half a century later, architectural record published an article, 1,000 Women in Architecture. This was 1948, March 1948. What do we know about those women? Very little, unfortunately. There are intriguing parallels, I think, with some of the contemporary magazines, ranging from Praxis, which is for architects, but also looking at Metropolis and Dwell, more popular magazines, all founded by women, all with large numbers of women on the staff, and all incorporating a range of ideas about innovations, incorporating a range of actors in terms of defining where things could go, how they could look, engaging different kinds of architects and different publics, both of which, in fact, are always in the plural. Now, none of this is a surprise to anyone here, yet the relative clarity of historical circumstances makes it easier to discern options and limitations in our own day. This encourages diversions from what are often the two norms of either passive acceptance or antagonistic opposition. To think historically is to see a matrix that connects changes and alternative possibilities and limitations. To look at external pressures and internal mechanisms, at conventional knowledge and at innovations. Innovations are not purely autonomous. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the US Patent Office in Washington will not take an application for an invention unless you have at least a paragraph on prior art in the field. So they recognize that no one just invents out of nowhere, as all too many architects think they can do. So history reveals biases, but it also gives us resources to draw upon. I'll conclude with 4 closely related points and questions drawn from these, drawn from a more inclusive approach to the history of American modernism. First is the cult of individual genius and celebrity tends to denigrate anything outside of that ideal. Constraints are seen as restrictions on the individual, and collaboration is seen as inherently boring or a mismatch. We all know that architecture actually has to happen through collaborations in an office. Or if nothing beyond that, you have to have collaborations on the building side. You have to have collaborations with clients and with banks and with various building workers and investigations that draw upon existing laws and different public groups, challenging them, giving them ideas of where to move. So how do we enhance respect for collaborative enterprises? A second one concerns strong form makers. Zaha Hadid and Inga Dubbeldam and the Harari sisters come to mind. I think they're wonderful. Some people feel, well, they outstage women, other women who are more restrained or more collaborative. So we can ask the question, what relationships other than opposition might be construed between these women and more restrained or collaborative male and female designers? Third is the issue of differences. Now, differences are, in fact, rather ambiguous. They can be, beyond this, they can be a matter of looking at gender differences as positive ways that we can respond to physiological differences in male and female bodies, or as oppressive ways in which we have notions of how women should be seen, what kinds of spaces in the house are they relegated to. So we can think about differences that are climactic or economic, differences that are cultural and individual and physiological and emotional that we should respect, but also inequalities that we want to move beyond. What criteria can we ask to be brought to bear about how to look at images and how to look at the options that we have? Now, to some extent, I've been talking about language because ultimately that, as much as images, is the way that the various institutions of power will operate. And so I want to raise a question about language. Isn't it time that we get rid of modernism being a matter of violations and assaults and ruptures? I'm really tired of that language. And to say so is to often have someone say, oh, you're just timid, you just want to go back to neo-traditional ideas, you don't have any excitement. We should at least give these terms a well-deserved sabbatical because they've been far overworked. But I think we also want to ask, what are issues that we can be angry about and raise? What are ways that we can ask of the profession of architecture certain kinds of changes that are important for everyone, as well as certain kinds of questions about how to use modernism to make the world more adventurous, more beautiful, and more equitable. Those have long been the goals of women in modernism. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. There is a lot to work on and to chew on and to contemplate there and to take further. And in that respect, I'm going to give very short introductions because you've got cheat sheets in your programs. But we have 3 speakers who have, at least among them, 6 different roles that could deal with this larger panorama of architecture culture that we're talking about. Sarah Herta will speak first. She's now executive director of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. They have a long history of sponsorship, so this brings her from the world of foundation funding and that sort of support system. But before that, many of us remember incredibly fondly her numerous years at the Storefront for Art and Architecture, that minuscule but powerhouse of ideas and creativity, and I think she brought nearly 40 exhibitions in the time that she was there to Storefront. So 2 roles for her, curator and foundation supporter. Toshiko Mori, I think, needs no introduction, but just to remind you that she is not only a extraordinarily talented architect with an incredible sense of material, some of which we've actually seen in installations here at the museum, but she is, of course, also professor in practice of architecture at Harvard University and has been department chair there since 2002. And so that another institution, absolutely legendary in the history of modernism, often with shared personnel with this one, and under Toshiko Mori's leadership. So she is on the panel both as practicing architect and as educator and university administrator. And finally, Karen Stein, who comes from many different worlds as well, but she is here for her long career as a writer and editor with various publications, Architectural Record, and then for quite a number of years, very importantly, editorial director at Phaidon Press, where she put together an extraordinary program of publications, but also for her role as architectural consultant in many guises, and she's a member of the jury of the Pritzker Foundation, Pritzker Prize. So that, again, 2 kinds of roles of this expanded architecture culture that Karen Stein brings together in her wide-ranging activities. So each of them will come up in turn and then take a seat at the table, and we will open to discussion. Sarah.
I think I have slides. Oh, that's not the beginning. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have been asked by the foundation to participate in this tonight's event. I am also the first woman director of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and I took that position last year. And it was a surprise, I think, to a lot of people, especially in Chicago. That was a big deal that they made, that I was the first woman and the 5th in 50 years. And the foundation, though I was a lucky recipient of the foundation's funding and enjoyed the support of Rick Solomon, my predecessor, I didn't actually know that much about the Graham Foundation. I knew the Graham Foundation basically from the time that I knew it as a great supporter of publications, exhibitions, but I did not know much about the history. And I actually realized I started with the wrong slide because it should have been this 1930s era portrait of Ernest Graham, because this is in fact the image that the foundation has always projected when presenting itself to the public. It was the cover of every annual report, the website, and it was hard to tell, in fact, from the way in which the foundation has communicated itself to the public, how it was founded. It was founded from a bequest from Ernest Graham. He was an architect that worked with Burnham, a prominent Chicago architect. He was also principal of Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. He left a bequest to start the American School of Fine Arts. And when he passed away in 1936, the executor of his will, Charles Murphy, his former secretary, had a 20-year window to do something with this money. The bequest, they lost a lot of the money. They had legal problems. In '55, when the window was really closing on this opportunity, they brought in Bill Hartman, who was a partner of SOM. And I'm going to give you a very quick synopsis of the beginning of the Graham Foundation, because I come to think of it as a sort of radical beginning of this very modern institution, which I had no idea before taking the position that it really was. They brought in Bill Hartman as a director, and consulted with John Burchard, who was then the dean of MIT Department of Humanities. And they convened a meeting in Aspen where they brought together thinkers in architecture to discuss how to not lose this opportunity of the bequest, because they didn't have enough money to start a school. They didn't, in fact, think that a kind of Beaux-Arts school is what needed to be done with this money. And they convened for a week-long meeting in Aspen. And people at this meeting included Rudolf Arnheim, a psychologist, professor at Sarah Lawrence, Pietro Belushi, Jimmy Ernst, the son of Max Ernst, a painter himself, as well as some prominent women. Aline Saarinen and her husband Eero Saarinen, the architect, and Catherine Bauer. And in this meeting, they sort of forged the what really became the foundation, and it was an interpretation of Ernest Graham's will, and that was to start a sort of alternative school made of fellows. And they, at the same time that they, coming out of this 1955 meeting, one of the results was an advisory board that included, this is the first advisory board from 1956. And so there's Mies van der Rohe, Sert, Gideon, Hartman, who was the director, the partner at SOM, Daniel Rich, who was the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, James Sweeney was the director of the Guggenheim Museum, Burchard was the Dean of Humanities, and Grace Morley, who was the director of the Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, now the SF MoMA, Museum of Art, now SF MoMA. And from this very beginning, this photograph was actually in my office at the Graham, and no one knew who she was when I came to the foundation. And it wasn't so much, I don't think, written out of history. It just wasn't an institution that had really projected itself to the public beyond kind of grant guidelines. And in these early years, this advisory board helped select fellows. The first program of the foundation were fellowships in the amount of $10,000 given internationally. In 1957, the first fellows included people like Harry Bertoia, Paul Nelson, photographer Harry Callahan. And in '58, the fellows included painter Eduardo Chalita, architect Bakrishna Doshi, painter Jose Guerrero, architect Tom Huha, architect Frederick Kiesler, painter Wilfredo Lam, architect Fumiko Maki, a philosopher Lancelot White. A part of the fellowship was this $10,000 to do, it was kind of a genius grant. I mean, in 1950, 1957 and 8, $10,000 was about the equivalent of $100,000, and it was to support them to do their work and to create to do something they wouldn't be able to do without the support. Another part of the fellowship was that they had to come to Chicago to convene a workshop that could be up to 8 weeks, and it was an institute on the arts. An interesting thing about these meetings is that they were attended, the wives of many of the artists attended all of the meetings. So they have these attendance sheets, and you see that Mr. and Mrs. Guerrero, Doshi, Chlita, they all participated. And what we found in this, what we're now starting as an archive project at the Graham, with documentations of these meetings where in fact women actively participated and were invited to sit in on these workshops. This is Catherine Koo, who was the first woman curator of European art and sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago. There was also the architect Eleanor Larrabee, wife of Eric Larrabee, who then became the director of the New York State Council on the Arts, artist and anthropologist Leonora Schwartz. And one of my favorite images from this period is here she is participating in the workshop, presenting, and here she is with her baby. I mean, this is completely against what anyone thinks of as the Graham Foundation today. When I was looking back and just looking very quickly at the first award to a woman, in fact, I thought it was Mildred Constantine in 1963 for her MoMA exhibition, The City, but it turned out to be a collaborative fellowship between David and Marion Jacob, and this, he an architect and she noted as a sculptress. It was a fellowship for $7,500, and this image is from their project, The World of Freeform. John Intenza described this project as to search out and to historically correlate architectural freeforms, explore techniques and processes for building in terms of examples from the past and present, continued studies in three-dimensional project models with statements from leading contemporary professionals, discussed and improved with Eero Saarinen. One of the next women, this is the first, Dora Ashton was the first independent fellow, grant of $5,000, and Ann Ting here, the grant of, another grant of $5,000 in '65. And when John Intenza became director, he was director during this time, and Esther McCoy also received a grant in 1971. I think what's really interesting about this period at the Graham and making this history available is that in it provides models for practice today. A lot of these women that were awarded grants are almost completely forgotten, or their role in actually shaping the Graham Foundation. And we are starting an archive project that will start to make these and other aspects of the Graham history accessible, because this is just one aspect. I mean, there's so many stories within this, and in doing that, we contextualize all of our activities today, because I think that that's important when you look at. You're able to look back at the kinds of risks that we were taking in the 50s and 60s and relate that to the kinds of projects. You may not know someone now that we're funding, but it's in this history, this kind of rich history of taking risks. About 20 years later, one of our public programs was called The State of the Art of Architecture. And of the about 24 participants, there wasn't a single woman. So just looking even within our own history, how did things change throughout the sort of participation of different kinds of people, even in those early years. I mean, gender is one issue, also race. We had people of color at the table in those 1957 and 8 seminars. And today, I'm the first woman director. Roberta Feldman is the first president of the board, who's our current chair. We have 4 women on the board today of 11. We had 5 women trustees last year, and we have our first person of color in the history of the foundation this year. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for inviting me, and thank you, Barry, for hosting this event. As a practicing architect and an educator, I like to talk about history as a present, because we do make history, not only looking at the past, and also future as well. She comes a little later, please. She does connect GSD and modernism and MoMA and so forth, but I like to, can you turn the image off, please? But she could stay if she wants to, okay. I love Annie. Although women represent minority in current profession scene, majority of our students, especially in our Master of Architecture 1 program, is women. With increasing number of women filling in the generation gap, we will see a dramatic shift in visibility of women in architecture in the next decade, if not in the next 5 years. I see women becoming the major force in our discipline, and it coincides with the general movement in desire in architecture to diversify its interest, broaden its horizon, and expand its base of expertise. More than ever, architects are carving out individually framed paths. Some are following traditional role of architects, and others are pioneers of brand new ways of formulating the research and design practices. Harvard accepted women as regular students in 1942, actually, to fill in the gap during the wartime. 57 years after MIT, and 64 years after the University of Illinois opened their doors to women, the faculty voted to formally admit women in 1948. That's when 1,000 Women in Architecture was published, so you can see how we are completely behind. I was the first woman to be tenured in 1995, and I am the first woman chair of the Department of Architecture since 2002. A very well-known CEO of major corporation proclaimed, "There's no such thing as a glass ceiling." He said, "What exists is a thick layer of men." And I have to say, I agree with him. Within this short period of 12 years, I have witnessed a sea change taking place at the school as well as at the world at large. The focus and interest of academic initiative is shifting from inventive filmmaking to collaborative, large-scale projects that integrate urban planning, urban design, and landscape architecture. There is a close alliance with technology and deeper engagement with history and theory. In general, I see a very collegial relationship emerging between the Faculty of Design, Technology, History, and Theory, and I see the same tendency emerging in profession as a result of recent surge in development of many large-scale collaborative projects. That is actually made up of multiple architectural, engineering, and consulting firms. I can observe more fluid and productive exchanges taking place between different fields in academia and practice which were previously isolated. It is reflection of increasingly more complex society, where scientific findings, humanistic value, and aesthetic vision must intersect. In order to produce a viable architectural solution, multifaceted investigation is a matter of necessity, and even a survival of discipline of architecture. As a chair, I have encouraged to guide the academic community toward this goal and direction. To participate in a global practice, one has to embrace diversity. Project in China, Dubai, or Iceland will involve studying differences in cultural practice, environment, geography, and climate. Local practices still deals with the same issues. The framework for exploration in architecture became inclusive. The range in scale varies from detailed industrial design to large-scale master planning project. And these students are concerned about the relevance of architectural profession in our society and today. They feel urgency in addressing social inequity, and they have desire to serve a community that may not have benefited from the work of architects. We are starting to see a generation of young architects who are conscientious, socially responsible, and once again interested in work for public service and for nonprofits. It is a healthy rebound from recent syndrome focused on elitist star architects. On the other hand, experiments with new technology, materials, and fabrication proposals lead them to new territories of investment in inventiveness in innovation. Coupled with sustainability and ecology as design contingencies, it is taking architecture to a bolder direction. In our everyday life at the school, at least at the GSD, our junior faculty is intensely interested in individual training of students to differentiate and nurture one's uniqueness. They invest considerable amount of time on desk crits. There's less theatricality involved in reviews, more desire to discussion with substance that's demanded by both faculty and students. In addition to the current need to prepare the students for much more demanding and complex and varied profession, the increase in number of students from various backgrounds and majors in a Mark I program contributes to this tendency. And this is actually the source of diversity of student body is a source of dynamism in our school. And this is the group where we find the most number of women participating. There is also an interest in revisiting modern architecture away from a mainstream, from a tradition of a GSD where Puritan ethic, coupled with European functionalism, chauvinism, and denial for study of history lingered for a long time. We are currently rebelling at the exuberance in studies of multiplicity of strategies, lively presence of women, and we are hungrily plunging into rich offerings in history and dynamic discussions in theory. When Gwendolyn characterized as excluded middle, this is precisely what we think is the most vibrant ground of exploration for us. This ambiguous middle ground is fertile because it escaped a narrow range of mainstream focus. Sarah Goldhagen's recent article on Alvar Aalto, Embodied Rationalism, in Harvard Design Magazine speaks about organic functionalism, concerns for human comfort and well-being embedded in the geometry and technical solutions in Aalto's designs. Aalto called it ultraviolet, a spectrum which is invisible under the radar of technologically rational designs. The current zeitgeist of modernism is already beyond the historical and obvious example and norms, and new interests such as effects, sensory experiences, atmosphere, ornament, surface, topology, and intricacy, coupled with sustainability and social equity, have been added to the ideals of form and functions in modernism. Instead of reduction, we are really thinking about reinterpreting abstraction. Instead of narrowing and limiting, contemporary condition calls for expanding and going beyond orthodoxy and even going beyond the boundary and questioning the boundary of modernism. In our school, which is steeped in the traditional modern, where studying Frank Lloyd Wright was forbidden, history books are sometimes taken away from a library. This regeneration and reinvention is taking place. So you have to understand we're like, woman issues one thing, we're actually suffering from a lot of other issues. We are carrying a lot of baggages with us. I have made a statement previously about feminization of technology through my work and research on textile, tectonic, and architecture. Annie comes up, please. Can I get Annie Albers back? Oh, no, that's her work. Annie Albers makes a prescient remark 50 years ago. The essential structural principles that relate the work of building and weaving could form the basis of a new understanding between the architect and the inventive weaver. New use of fabrics and new fabrics could result from a collaboration in textiles. So for no more than an afterthought in planning might take a place again as a contributing thought. And I find it very, very impressive that she actually said that in 1957. And as Barry pointed out, she actually is in the background of Joseph Albers, but in a sense, her writing and her work is a very important inspiration, especially for me. We witnessed a kind explosion in advanced technology dominating fields of medical, aeronautical, naval, to military operations. The advantage of technique is based on properties such as resilience, continuity, suppleness, lightness, layering, portability, and ability to multitask. These are some of the projects that students are working material explorations. This is actually toilet paper projects. They actually stole a toilet paper. I had to construct a wall for the refugees. The high performance criteria in engineering of textile fabrication is actually based upon traditional feminine wisdom. Weaving as a metaphor also points to our current work mode for expanded collaboration as well. In examining and rethinking the categories of architectural history away from episodic breakthroughs in individual achievement, our teaching method of case study model, which was started around 1970s, taking cue from a business school, is a useful tool. Instead of a survey, our curriculum in building text and context, and as well as for all the other courses, environmental studies, to structures, to professional practice, they look at architecture as a holistic whole. It studies processes, all of the players, and context included. The method can bring out nuances, subtleties, and multiplicity of interpretations. Recently, many women architects and scholars contributed to uncover or cast a fresh eye upon new conditions in architecture and urbanism. An ability to see a larger and different picture by connecting the dots gave rise to significant scholarship and discovery for previously unknown or marginalized territories and subject matter. A good example is Iplo's project Zagreb that examines transition as a condition that creates opportunity for architecture. And she actually examined a city which is in perpetual transition, really proposes that perhaps architecture as the contingent strategies. And what's wonderful about it, her assistant, Ian Lupnick, grandmother, worked on this building. And this is actually, and she has uncovered many examples of previously unknown modern architecture through this particular lens of hers. Oops. Oh, sorry. Grandmother again. Sarah Goldhagen focuses on structural deficiency of aging American infrastructure, a mundane subject matter, but it all adds up. Power plants, bridges, highways, and schools, these actually add up to $1.6 trillion worth of public liability. Farshid Musavi's research on functional ornament and experiments on surface manipulation on new type of high-rise buildings give twist to new modernist paradigm. This is her Bundle Towers project, interdependent. Louis Hutton, the partner of Sowerbrook Hutton, his work is focused on sustainable buildings and use of color on large-scale buildings. There is a richness in each one's passionate focus, which collectively contributes to a major sea change. The discipline of architecture is more broadly defined. It engages with other disciplines such as urban design, planning, and infrastructure, and those practices call for creativity and vision. All of these different foci help to generate brighter choices for the career of future generation. Architecture is one of a few professions where one can confidently say that there are multiple paths and choices to the career, from working in a traditional corporate offices to opening a single-person practice while raising a family. Teaching, research, or combining or changing a path in mid-career is even possible. identity of architects is changing as well. As opposed to the image of a singular heroic figure, in the current generation of women architects, each person is confident and comfortable about who she is, and stereotyping is obsolete. Marianne Thompson, whose architecture integrates with her training in landscape design, is unabashedly nurturing. She's a great teacher. Yes, she has 5 kids too. Alexia Leon of Lima, Peru, a rare woman heading a practice in South America, is determined yet relaxed. Her buildings are precise, harmonious, and sophisticated. Tian Tian Xu, one of the very few women heading a practice in Beijing, is quiet and gentle, but who has an iron will. She makes spatially generous architecture devoid of cliches. Amalia Andaraos, Lebanese-Canadian, practicing in New York, a partner of work, is energetic, intelligent, and witty with her processes and formal expressions. And Mimi Wang, partner of N Architects, is thoughtful, whose work is exhibited as a part of PS1 Young Architects Forum, experimental, inventive. And Sheila Kennedy is tall and severe. Her material experiments that merges with social cause is a new mode of practice. And Kazuyo Sejima is restrained and quiet. Her architecture is fragile, ethereal, delicate, and transparent, but her collaborators say she is the strongest architect they have ever worked with. At our school, the mirror to the outside world is a list of option studio critics. We have 9 to 10 architects we invite each semester to teach. And 15 years ago, I was only 1 person out of 10 male critics, with such as Enrique Miralles, Rafael Moreno, Jacques Herzog, and Carlos Yunes. But out of 10, there were 5 women, Marianne Thompson, Yuso, Andrea Elias, who actually won the AIA Firm Award, the first time women's firm won it, Laura Miller, Sheila Kennedy, mentioned, Monica Ponce de Leon. Among the other 4, 3 men are partners with women, Ryue Nishizawa with Kazuyo Sejima, Brendan McFarlane with Dominic Jacob, Hani Rashid with Lisan Couture. And we ended up with only 1 man who's heading his own practice, is Pachi Mangado of Pamplona, Spain. As you can see from my presentation, I'm enthusiastic about women in architecture of our day. They are brilliant, hardworking, creative, innovative, making their mark. New voices and directions are created by robust work of women architects today, contributing to empowering the profession at large. Maria Shriver's conference on women in California this week was titled, Women as Architects of Change. If that's true, women architects are the agents of change in our society. We have to recognize the sea change taking place and acknowledge and change a narrow attitude that is trapped in historicists whining about this entire issue. Our task as those who are in the position of power is to make them visible, have their voices heard, help engage them with larger platform, and to make them connect to each other. I'm sorry, this is time, but I have to read this. I would like to read an excerpt from inaugural speech by my president, Jill Faust, who was installed just 2 weeks ago, the first woman president of Harvard. In the past half century, American colleges and universities have shared in the revolution, serving as both the emblem and the engine of the expansion of citizenship, equality, and opportunity to blacks, women, Jews, immigrants, and others who would have been subjected to quotas or excluded altogether in an earlier era. My presence here today, this is Jill Faust speaking, and indeed that of many others on this platform, and I was there, would have been unimaginable even a few short years ago. Those who charge that universities are unable to change should take note of this transformation of how different we are from universities even of the mid-20th century. And those who long for a lost golden age of higher education should think about the very limited population that alleged utopia actually served. College used to be restricted to a tiny elite. Now it serves the many, not just the few. The proportion of the college-age population enrolled in higher education today is 4 times what it was in 1950, 12 times what it has before the 1920s, she says. Ours is a different and a far better world. To conclude, the place of women in history of modern architecture is still evolving. We must be relentless and diligent about continuous effort to make opportunity for women of a future generation and for the architecture. Thank you very much.
I want to add my thanks to those already mentioned, to Beverly and Barry, for inviting me to participate in the program this evening. I'd also particularly like to thank Gwendolyn for the opportunity to comment on her research and presentation. Gwendolyn has touched on many issues that are worthy subjects of debate and discussion, but I thought I would reflect briefly, and I emphasize briefly because I know we're running over, on one particularly small part of her presentation. I agree with Gwendolyn's point that what she calls the internal mechanisms of power within the profession of architecture is worth examination. She notes, interestingly, that conventional wisdom says that there have been few women and no significant women modernists in architecture, but I understand Gwendolyn has the research and statistics that contradict this. So if we accept that the perception of the role of women in modernism does not match the reality of that role, it's only natural that we should look for an answer as to the source of that disconnect. Much of the answer, as Gwendolyn suggests, can be found in the mechanisms of power she refers to, be it the media, professional organizations, educational programs, curatorial programs, or some combination of these. It is these mechanisms of power and their biases that are somehow responsible for the gap between the actual performance or output of certain architects and the public perception of it. I think it's worth considering how we understand such mechanisms, how we think they are made, and how we think they in fact operate. There's often the perception that the effects of power and influence can be understood as linear, that the trajectory, say, of a particular architect's career path, once subject to the manipulations and supposed privileges of power, can be directed to predictable, desirable results. This implies that power is designed, much like a machine or a series of machines with specific parts and pieces and connections, and that it can be put to use to predetermined results. The implication is that once the design of a power system is understood, it is possible to break the code, tap into the relevant connections, and achieve to some large extent the desired outcome. Now, if we accept for argument's sake that those of us participating in this program this evening represent various aspects of a power system, media, scholarship, connoisseurship, and if we believe that the system operates in the linear, predictable manner that I've just described, then it would follow that those of us here could, or some such similar group, could put our heads together and manipulate the system to whatever ends we choose. We could guide a particular career to glory or to ruin. However, disappointingly or not, that is not actually possible with a large degree of accuracy. Despite whatever efforts or influence we may or may not be able to bring to bear, there are too many unpredictable factors over time whose impact we could not possibly anticipate. So in fact, I would say the best description or analogy for the mechanisms of power in the architectural profession is not a linear, mechanical system, but rather chaos theory. In this context, the word chaos is not intended to describe a state of confusion. Chaos as part of chaos theories refers to a seeming lack of order in a system that nevertheless obeys particular rules or patterns. I think it's worth a little background here so there's some context for my analogy. The two main aspects of chaos theory are, one, the idea that there are systems, no matter how complex and seemingly indecipherable they may be to the naked eye, that they actually have an underlying order. And two, that very simple or small occurrences can compound over time to cause very complex effects or events. This latter point is known as sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So how does chaos theory relate to systems of power in architecture? Quite neatly, in my opinion. There is, at first glance, a seeming randomness to why, for example, two emerging architects who demonstrate equal talent and are given similar opportunities end up, over the long run, having dramatically divergent careers in terms of success and acclaim. While it is purely hypothetical to imagine two architects with nearly identical talent and circumstance, for argument's sake, let's assume such a thing is possible. Now, if you were to track these two architects over the long course of their careers, you would see the positive effects of good training and mentorship has on their careers. That's the underlying pattern part of chaos theory. You would also see that seemingly negligible differences compounded by random events and occurrences will have amplified over time to have made significant differences in the two architects' trajectories. That's the sensitive dependence on initial conditions part of chaos theory. And what about predicting which of these two architects will do better? At this point, it's worth noting that it's no accident that the so-called father of modern chaos theory, Edward Lorenz, a professor of MIT, was a meteorologist, because weather has distinct repeating patterns but cannot be predicted with complete accuracy. The weather forecast for tomorrow is probably 85 to 90% accurate. The forecast for the day after tomorrow is probably 70% accurate, and so on for the days after that. We accept as common sense that weather is increasingly hard to predict further and further away from the present. But what accounts for the small degree of uncertainty over weather just 12 hours away? Minute changes, a cold front moving 2 or 3 miles an hour faster or slower than originally predicted, subtle changes in water temperature, all these types of things have a cumulative effect. One of Lorenz's groundbreaking studies on chaos theory is entitled Predictability: Does the Flap of a Butterfly's Wings in Brazil Set Off a Tornado in Texas? The flapping wings here represent a small change in the initial condition of the system, which causes a chain of events leading to large-scale phenomena. Now, to bring my analogy back to our area of concern tonight, one might ask, in reference to the exhibition currently on view here at the museum, the Lost Vanguard Soviet Modernism Architecture of 1922 to 32, one might ask, does the click of a camera in Kiev change the preservation movement in America? Or does that same click of the camera rewrite the history of international modernism? Now, perhaps when Richard Pear, whose photographs comprise the bulk of the exhibition, started making trips to Russia some 15 years ago, one or both of those ambitions were in his mind. Could Pear have predicted the incredible economic boom in Russia that would lead developers to alter or tear down buildings regardless of their historical significance? Perhaps. Could Richard Pear have anticipated that Barry would be newly installed as the chief curator of architecture here at MoMA, and with his long-standing interest in alternate histories of modernism, would embrace Richard's photographs and make them the subject of international attention? I think that's less likely. So all of this is just to emphasize the complexity of forces, both their predictability and unpredictability, the rationality and seeming irrationality of how they progress that are present when we talk about mechanisms of power. So if chaos theory is true, and there's quite a bit of science to back it up, and if it applies to power mechanisms in the architecture profession in the ways I've just sketched out briefly, then, like the flapping of a butterfly's wings, any single statement made here tonight has the ability to change the course of architectural history. So, depending on your point of view, that is either pretty scary or pretty exciting, or maybe even both. Thank you.
I'd like to ask everyone to come up. We're going to try to be a bit more concise in our interrogation of one another so that we can open the floor also to everyone else. So patiently listening. I think we've heard not only a incredible range of views, but actually what struck me as actually a somewhat of a discrepancy in answering the question, what time is it? I heard optimism. I heard from Toshiko seems to say that in fact there is a sea change that's already taken place. It's merely a matter of organizational force and a kind of networking and the exploitation of an enormous change that's happened in the very recent past in order perhaps to make the kind of great change happen that Karen seems to tell us is related more or less to chance. Gwendolyn seems to suggest that there are systems of power that are still in place that need, in fact, to be unveiled and examined, and that I took it that your picture was not quite so rosy and optimistic, seen with the longer historical perspective and, in a certain sense, from outside directly the practice. And Sarah seemed to suggest that there might have, in fact, been suddenly an undiscovered golden moment in the 50s and 60s, unless I'm misinterpreting, and that something has changed again recently. So there seems to be a kind of different relationship both to the profile of history and to the question, what time is it now? So I just wondered if this set of discrepancies was something the four of you experienced, or if I'm amplifying.
Can I just say that I wasn't saying that it's completely a question of chance. I was saying that there's certain underlying patterns that one can sort of predict and discern and shape, but that there is also the effects of unexpected events. So it's not one or the other, but it's the intersection of the two.
Well, I would certainly agree with you, Karen, that there are things that we don't see in a pattern. I never wanted to suggest that there is a linear pattern of history in which everything either stays just the same or moves up or down. There are always things that have been suppressed, as I think your story of the Graham Foundation is quite interesting, because it shows us once again that it's not as if the past is as simple as we have been told it was. There are exciting things there, and that gives a sense of opportunities in the present. At the same time, I would disagree slightly with Toshiko. There are obviously a lot more women in practice. There are a lot more women teaching. That doesn't mean there are no longer problems, either about women or about power. And I tried to pose this in terms of looking at the ways that the larger architecture culture functions, or even that the larger American culture functions. And if we were to say, well, today everything is really wonderful, that everyone can do whatever they want, and there are great opportunities to change the government whenever you want, I think most of us would find there to be difficulties that we still have to ask questions about. That the examples that you gave are quite wonderful, but at the same time, I at least, perhaps as a historian, I don't think that we should say it's all wonderful now. I don't think that the field is entirely changed. Maybe it's in part because I teach at Columbia that I still see a very strong focus on kind of male approaches to creativity, which is just springing out of the head of Zeus, that it's mine and nobody else has it, and I'm not influenced by anything else, and I certainly wouldn't want to collaborate. I find it difficult to try to open those up, and so it obviously changes from school to school, but I would suggest that there might even be some difficulties at Harvard. I don't know what they are, but
a couple of things. I'm not a historian, so I usually don't. I take history as a basis of innovation, and I'm a practitioner, meaning I have to do something now, and but I do it for future. I don't whine about what happened with women. I like to make a change today. I'm too impatient as a practitioner and teacher to go back and whine. So that's one thing. And second of all, Harvard does not have this tradition, and we have to make it. The time is for us to make the history, and if we don't say we are strong, we are leaders, we're going to empower, we just can't go back. We have absolutely no choice but go to this direction and thinking optimism and lead women, and then encourage young women to pursue their dreams. I have absolutely no choice, Gwendolyn.
I totally agree, Toshiko, but I
This
don't
has
think
nothing
it's
to do.
whining to say that there has been discrimination in the past, and that not everything is open and equally free in the present. It's very important to be positive. I'm actually a very optimistic person, and as a historian, someone who thinks that we study history in order to have material to help us move ahead. But at the same time, I think that posing it as either one is whining by talking about problems or else you're being positive is not necessarily the most helpful way to be dealing with issues, because that tends to then put anyone who asks the question as just being a whiner, and I don't think that's necessarily positive.
How do you propose what you're going to do with this generation of young women? What do you propose?
That's a somewhat different question than what
But I
what
think
this
that
discussion
is a
supposed to be.
critical question for me.
Absolutely.
I'm a woman of action. I gotta do something, and I see an urgency. And because I see it's a problem, that's why I think we have to move into action. We just cannot stay where we are. We can't keep looking back. I appreciate the studies, but that's your role as historian. That's your job. Okay, my job is to just
Tashika,
bulldoze
nobody is
ahead.
saying that all we
Go-
want to
go
do is just to
ahead.
hold on to the problems. Nobody's saying that at all. I certainly am not. And the said, I know a lot of wonderful young women architects, both students and practitioners. This is in no way to say that they are burdened forever to be part of an oppressive system, but I think that they might well face some difficulties. And one of the ways of being able to move ahead for anyone is that you're aware of there have been other people who face difficulties. It's not just your fault, your problem, your weakness, your difficulty that is somehow unique. And that's one of the roles of history, is seeing a pattern of things that have been difficult, as well as seeing opportunities that one can build upon. But I would imagine that it'd be very helpful for
But
young
at
women
the
students
same
today
time,
to
we
have an
just-
awareness of some of those.
I think
Historical
we should.
dis-
I think we want to open this
Okay.
up just a little bit. If either the other two respondents have a question for anyone here before we really take what I sense as a eagerness to jump
Could I
in.
just
Sarah,
kind of keep
please.
in that? I mean, in a similar vein. I mean, I'm not a historian either, but in looking back at the Graham Foundation, and actually, one aspect of me taking this job is that people have kind of characterized it as it's such a radical shift, making me kind of out of place in this long tenure of male directors, and it's as if I'm remaking a very conservative institution. For me to go back into and pleasantly, I mean, so important to find that history within the foundation, and then to take that a step further to make that available, because I think within that there were a lot of path-breaking women. There was a lot of, I mean, not only the women involved, but there was just a lot of progressive thinking, participation, and in a way it sort of recasts, just in a very small way. I mean, I didn't really frame that very well, but the reason I offered up this kind of little alternative history of the Graham Foundation, because I think it radically changed my perception of that institution, and I think that in maybe one aspect of my role of as the director is to then make that history more available, because it was buried to me, the director. I mean, in fact, I can't even find out how many. That will change now because we just imported things into a new sort of database. But we don't have statistics on how many women we funded. We don't have statistics on, so it's like taking stock of what we have and then making that available as all kinds of models and patterns. And I think that to move forward for sort of the younger women today, we need models, and they're not all springing from.
I think actually the operation that you're talking about, though, Sarah, is really part of the unveiling of myth that is part of this history process, and in that sense. The history becomes an activity related to some kind of resistance to these power structures. It's not simply describing the power structures, but it's describing sets of myths that have come to have a life of their own, and you discover them in your institution. Every institution has them. I can't tell you how many times I've been told what a revolution it is that I'm the first historian to take the role of the Department of Architecture and Design in hand. This is not true. The first curator was Philip Johnson, who was a historian. He got so infected by this, he decided to go to Harvard to become an architect. But that doesn't serve the kind of established myths that are always much cleaner and more convenient, and therefore take on this power in their myth structure. That's why I found your actual story was so fascinating, not only as role model, but actually as a way to kind of destabilize the myth. I wonder if we shouldn't open it up to the audience
Why
for
don't we first see
questions.
if Karen, who was
Karen,
so
do you?
responsible of not speaking too long at the podium, too, if you have something you want to say now, I don't want to leave you out.
Well, there may in fact be questions for Karen, who spoke specifically very nicely to Gwen's paper and kind of brought us full circle to bring everything in. Are there questions in the audience? Is there a roving microphone that Wanda has? Where did I see the first hand go up here?
Hi. Thanks. This has been really interesting. I'm having a really good time not being at school, which is great. My school, by the way, is run by nuns. So I don't have any of these male power issues.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to say, except when they fire the priest, which is very interesting. I saw something today that I had never seen before in the history of women in architecture. I saw a trend where you had a group of women acting active in the field of architecture immediately before a major period of feminist movement. So we had a string of women that I know, Gwendolyn, you showed it, and Hazelwood Waterman and Julia Morgan, right before the 1920s. Then we have the women active in the Graham Foundation, active immediately before the 1970s rise of feminism. I wonder if we are, as Tushiri shows us, are we poised for a new wave of feminism? Is this action, this rise of women in the field of architecture and their remaking of how architecture is practiced, is that a predictor for something that is about to happen? Perhaps the question is not what time is it now, but what time will it be? I don't know.
I think that's a question for everyone, so if anyone wants to.
I think precisely my opinion is it's actually, I call it Jill Faust syndrome. We have a woman president. I call it Hillary syndrome. Somehow the world is actually getting used to women having major leaders. And I think there's a new shift in feminism. And then I think there is something going on which is historically different now from a pre-feminism time. So I think one of the things is that I have to do my job. Gwendolyn, you do your job. We have to look back and we have to look forward. But the job for all of us is to locate where we are right now. And I think your observation, to me, resonates very well. I think that's actually in terms of what's happening right now. So I'm like really going different direction.
Other questions, conveniently the same row?
My question is more to the critics and the people who are writing architecture through scholarship and through exhibitions. What kinds of questions do you think we are asking of women architects, and are those questions different than the ones we ask of male architects? And what is that? How does that reflect on, you know, the kind of work that we're doing?
Do you mean literally? What kind of questions are we asking? Yeah. If I was going to write about a building done by a woman architect versus a man architect, are you asking if I would ask different questions
I
about?
guess, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be in a conversation, but also sort of theoretically. How do we structure?
I'm not
questions?
aware that I would ask different questions, but I haven't studied my approach to those things. But I wouldn't. I'm not aware that I would ask different questions.
I think venture a hypothesis. Other historians can immediately beat me down if this is wrong, but I do think that one thing that the study of women in architecture, one thing that hasn't come out tonight is the old cliche that until perhaps a generation ago, it was as frequent to find a woman working in collaboration with a life partner as it was working independently. I mean, obviously there are many important exceptions to that, but that was an established pattern. It's still with us now, but it's just the sheer numbers are such that it's more diverse. The point I wanted to make is that I think that actually the study of women in architecture over the last 30 years has raised most prominently the issue of collaboration. It's not simply that is an issue with women in architecture, it's that an attentiveness to the issue of women in architecture has really made even a greater urgency to talk about collaboration in architecture and how that functions.
I think that's very true. It's one of the things that has been an asset for many women, that they embrace the idea of collaboration rather than refusing to acknowledge it, because it's still there with almost every building that is made. But a lot of women, whether they're collaborating in a partnership, or whether they're part of a firm, or whether they're working with architects and other architects, or with engineers, or with artists, or with people in building materials research, there's a sense of feeling that that's positive, as opposed to feeling that that somehow takes away from their creativity. At the same time, there is sometimes, not all critics by any means, but there are some critics that presume women will only collaborate. That is the nature somehow of what some women will do. And that's an unfortunate myth to create too, that because there's a pattern that it's going to continue, or it's somehow essential to the nature of one group or another. There was a point in which, for instance, when there began to be a number of African American architects, the assumption was that they would all do housing, as opposed to allowing as many opportunities for them to do a range of kinds of buildings as there might be, that there was an expectation that they would be wanting to do social issues only. And I think that is sometimes applied to women. By no means in all cases, and I do think that it's shifting, but it helps us make the shift to acknowledge that there has been a tendency to be narrow, or a tendency to downplay the kind of collaboration or the kinds of social issues that have been there in the past.
See numerous questions in the.
I run a practice in Washington, D.C., which is pretty large. I have 40 people to feed, and I really take exception to the comments made about whining, because it's an everyday battle for us to get the work, to get paid, to do the work that we want to do. It's also a question I have is, everything I've seen in the press and everything that's published seems to be going through a filter. Even the work that's shown by the lady from Harvard, the work of the people that she showed was also something that seems to be gone through a filter of a certain kind of aesthetic, a certain kind of modernism. And I was wondering if you think that when will there be a time in architecture when each artist's work, each architect's work is truly their own and not seen through the filter of what men have created?
Anyone want to take that on?
I'll start. I'm sure that we should actually have a couple of responses to that. I think, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that there are difficulties. There are difficulties for every architect, but that women, especially women who also want to have a family, do have difficulties in balancing those things. They point out that all of us do in terms of whatever other obligations we might have. At the same time, I don't think that there is ever going to be a perfect moment in which everyone is given equal status and everyone can be the person that she or he wants to be. It won't happen in the arts, but it certainly won't happen in architecture, because there's a lot of money involved, and so everyone will not be given the same opportunities. The question, I think, is to take those issues and say, how can we expand those without necessarily saying the only alternative is a circumstance in which everyone is judged for themselves in every single instance, because reputations, examples of work that you've done, proving that you've been able to carry a large project through, etc., those will all have an impact just as much as being in the newspaper or being called a celebrity will certainly help bring certain work in. That those things do exist, and the more we can try to see them as patterns but not as absolute obstacles that nothing can be done about, the better.
I see so many hands, and we don't have a lot of time. I'm afraid I haven't seen any order, but here in
Chaos
listening
theory, there we go.
Chaos theory, yeah.
Hi. I think that this is obviously a pressing issue, as you can see, to the women on the panel as well as the women in the audience. What I'm not really seeing is the presence of as many men, obviously. But I'm wondering if you see that there is a responsibility to men for this cause, or if you see this really as more of an issue for women bonding together to overcome some kind of an oppression.
Shall I answer that? I think that men are missing a lot by not being here, because it's half the world is made by women. And at the GSD, we have a very active group called Women in Design, and they do social events and gathering, and many men students do come and participate, because what's interesting about it is in my speech, I try to kind of convey that the issues and urgencies, it's actually, there's no gender issues. It's actually they, in fact, realize they are shared issues in terms of collaboration. It's not only women who's looked at in one way, but men collaborating with women are also looked at in different way within the world of men as a single heroic practitioners too. So, and they have families and they will share duties, and then issues I think will be shared, and it's not really, it's actually the shared responsibility. So to a lot of extent, I think this narrowing of women in architecture, I'm a little bit worried about it. It's too oppositional to me in terms of gender. I think the issues are a little bit more global, but then we just have to, I don't know, you could talk to your friends who are men and talk about this, and I think I talk to my male colleagues who, essentially sometimes are not aware of it. I think a lot of times men are not really realizing these things they have to think about. So engage them in a dialogue is absolutely essential to make these things happen.
Well, first, there are a number of men here, and maybe you can't see them, but they're not half the audience, but they're certainly here. There is an interest, and we have all of us been trying to speak about a range of issues that don't just affect women. I think it's wonderful talking with women friends and with women colleagues, but I don't think that that exclusion in that sense, or insisting upon there being a certain female way of being an architect is at all the alternative to denying the work that women have done. So it's, I agree with Toshiko in that there are a lot of men who could benefit from this, and there are also a lot of men who care about these issues, not only in terms of women's lives, but realizing that the issues that are brought up about women in many ways relate to other questions about opportunities that we have, about limitations that are placed on us, about expectations of who one should be or what kind of work one should do.
But I also think that there's, I remember in one of my interviews for the Graham Foundation, someone said, and Chicago has a really strong network of women. And I was kind of taken aback because I couldn't imagine ever hearing that in New York, sorry, Monty. Certainly wasn't in my first interview at Storefront. But, and since, being in Chicago, there actually are these really incredible networks of women. And I think that I went to a women's college, I went to Mills College, but I think that it's, it is important to have those peer those groups. And so Chicago has Chicago Women in Architecture. It exists as a kind of, as a way to address issues, as a way to, activate a peer network. And I think it's important. And I don't think that really exists so much in New York, especially for architecture. And where it does exist for the art world, it can often be very exclusive and hard to get into. So I think that there is a real value in, starting up something like that at whatever scale.
Maybe we have time for 2 or 3 questions, depending on how provocative they are. We have a rail
We have a
mail
man
question
here.
here.
Asking you questions, good.
We have the.
Thank you. I guess what I think everyone on the panel spoke a little bit about acting in a collaborative sense, and that being a characteristic that we don't see so much in the male-oriented history of architecture, but that we see to a great extent in the female history of architecture and the present, what's going on. So addressing the political and social aspects of architecture and how architecture has the potential to create socio-political actions and solutions. I think my question is, how do we kind of, as architects and people in the field or concerned people, how do we harness the potential, I guess, that you've been talking about, that women have in architecture of having a community sense of design, and how do we bring men into that community so that we can design not so much as a male-female thing, but just as a larger community of concerned architects?
I think that's very important, and I think that that one of the great risks of this discussion or others would be a notion of exclusivity. It's not something that I want. There are some women who thrive in an all-female world, and that's fine too. Obviously, the world of powerful artists and architects has largely been all male. They just didn't call it that, but it's what happened de facto, that clubs and restaurants and offices and so forth were predominantly men's clubs. They just didn't say it quite often. But the sense of wanting to encourage these as opposed to having to be qualities that women have is really important, and it gives men a lot of options. And it, again, I think needs to be balanced by acknowledging that sometimes women will want to do fantastic, powerful, formal work on their own. It's not as if they can only work when they're collaborating. So it really becomes important to be open to those kinds of possibilities rather than having it be exclusive to either side.
All the way in the back, the hand that's highest out. Yours, yes. I think this will have to be the last question because I think we will be
Oh, how lucky I
expunged
am.
from the auditorium.
Well, and then as we close, I really wanted to make sure we didn't, that we think about among ourselves the unique issue of race, class, and power among women as well. I teach in a School of Architecture in Baltimore area, and we have a lot of women in our new program at Morgan State University, and the women who are in our architecture school are not the same people who you're probably familiar with, who are architects and have second, 2-3 generations of designers and come from, well-heeled families and so forth. And as we know, the profession has always been a little elitist, and even though we have progressive views, we tend to be on the little left of center, but still a little elitist. And I think that we need to be sure that we address the issues of communication and publicizing the work of each other as well, but also among women, there's race, class, and power issues that we need to communicate and deal with too. So I just wanted to make sure we put that out there. It's not just a male-female thing. It's definitely a woman-to-woman thing too, that we need to just address, and we can address it because we can do that. So.
I think that's exactly what Beverly wanted, was it's to end on the note not only that there can be a dialogue between the work of history and contemporary issues, and I think we've seen that illustrated in the individual interventions tonight and the talk, but also you didn't identify yourself, but I think that what I picked you at random, but it's perfect because it suggests that there's a lot more work to be done. There are ways to complicate these questions, and Beverly has to continue her work in framing new issues and keeping the series moving and challenging. So I'm very grateful that she suggested this program, and thank you all for coming out with good questions and so much enthusiasm. And thanks to all of our speakers.